right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is the annual meeting for the Hingham Land Conservation Trust, so I hope you're all in the right place. My name is Joe Beerworth. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. So again, thanks for coming. We have a short business portion of our meeting, which those of you who come to our meetings know does not take very long, but a requirement that we do every year. So the primary order of business is the election of our Board of Directors and officers for the upcoming year. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is read the slate of candidates for the directors and for the officers. Our president, Skip Hull, wasn't able to make it tonight. He had a business appointment, so he is not here, but he has been our president now for the past couple of years and will be nominated again to continue to serve as president. For vice chair, I have had that obligation for the past couple of years, but I'm going to step aside in favor of Eileen McIntyre, who is here. And for the members of the board, when I say your name, please stand so everyone can put a name to a face. So Eileen is nominated as a member of the Board of Directors and as vice chair for our upcoming year. Tom Bright has been our treasurer and has done a great job. So we're keeping Tom on in that role. Martha Falvey, likewise, has been our secretary, and we'd like to have Martha continue in that role. The other members of the Board of Directors have various duties with respect to our properties and projects that come up. Don Kidson has been a longtime member of the board. There's Don. Nick Souls. Nick helps with a lot of our work on the properties. Barbara Wolin, over by the door, checked you in, and she handles a lot of our administrative and record-keeping duties and all sorts of things. So, a great member of the board. Myself, even though I'm not going to be vice chair, I'm going to stay on as a member of the board. We have a couple of new members this past year, 2017, last year I should say. So Patty Krumholtz there, already standing. All right. And Rick Rollator. Rick. There's Rick. And we have a new name for nomination for 2018. My friend Art Collins, the tall guy in the back there. That is our slate of directors and officers for this upcoming year. So I would accept a motion to elect those members and officers. So moved. Do I hear a second? Second. All right. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none. The motion is passed, and we have our slate of directors. So congratulations to us. And we look forward to continuing to provide you with these programs, the walks that we do, maintaining the properties, and being here as a resource for land conservation within the town of Hingham. So we have some great speakers lined up for tonight, and Eileen's going to do the introductions for those, and that's why you're all here, so we'll move on to that. So thanks.
Thanks, Joe, and good evening, everyone. Tonight's program is focused, as the title suggests, on the evolution of the land use in what we're terming the harbor front. Some of you may think of this as the inner harbor. Specifically, it's the land along the harbor, beginning at the Maritime Center and following Summer Street and then Otis Street, just past the bathing beach to Broad Cove. So that's what we're focusing on tonight. Our program begins with a fascinating jog through 3 centuries of change along the harbor front. Andrea Young, the administrator of both the Hingham Historical Commission and the Hingham Historic Districts Commission, will be our guide. Andrea's slides will highlight key developments along the harbor from the founding of Hingham through the 20th century. Bill Reardon, chair of the Harbor Development Committee, will follow Andrea and focus primarily on the past 15 years when the town of Hingham has acted opportunistically but with vision in addressing multiple infrastructure needs in this area. During this period, as Bill will discuss, both private and public interests also have begun to bring new life to the harbor front. And then after Bill gives us just a quick peek into the future, we'll open the program for the Q&A session. Given our need to end the program before the library closes at 9 p.m., we will once again, as we did in the past, ask you to submit your questions on the cards that we've provided, and if you don't have a card and you'd like one, Patty can get you one, and we have some pens as well. So feel free to take as many cards as you may need. It should be an interesting and thought-provoking, perhaps question-provoking presentation. We won't be stopping during the formal part of the presentation for questions, but we will then get into all of those, and I'll moderate the Q&A. Joining Andrea and Bill for the Q&A session will be Alan Peralt, who some of you may know as the chair of the trustees of the Bathing Beach, and Nancy Kerber, who is the president of the Board of Trustees of the Hingham Maritime Center. So we've really brought together a family of individuals who have interests involving the harbor front. And now, I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Eileen. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm really pleased to have been asked to do this presentation. I must say that the lion's share of the credit goes to Eileen McIntyre for putting this whole thing together. All right. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge a couple of institutions who keep our archives and our history for the town of Hingham, and that is the Hingham Historical Society and the Hingham Public Library. And two individuals in particular should be given credit for what has been put together this evening. And one is Michael Achille, who is an archivist at the Historical Society and also the local history librarian here at the library. The other is Jerry Duff, who just is amazing in her work at the Historical Society, and you also, I'm sure, know that she is very involved, and she and her team make the Fire Museum what it is. And Jerry also is the person who selects the pictures for Hingham's Yesterdays in the journal, and writes the caption on the bottom. Let me move to our first slide. We begin in 1633. I'm so delighted that the Inner Harbor area was chosen because it is, of course, where our town begins in the 17th century. So the monument shown here is located on North Street at the corner of Ship Street. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this, and it's a bronze marker. It was given to the town by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but its significance is that it marks the spot where Peter Hobart and his band of God-fearing Puritans landed at the foot of Ship Street. It is also situated on the banks of the Mill Pond, and at that time the Mill Pond was connected to the harbor, so it was a continuous waterway allowing for Peter Hobart's ship to land. Jumping now into the 18th century, the harbor front and its busy wharves were vital as the town of Hingham started to grow during and after the Revolutionary War. As noted on this slide, many of the names long associated with our town's history were among the merchants, mariners, and shipwrights who owned and used wharves along the inner harbor. Throughout the first century or so of our town's history, the inner harbor was also important as a commercial fishing area. The extensive Mill Pond was also used for fishing at that time. Among the plentiful fish that came in with the tides were the mackerel and smelt. In support of the commercial fishing industry, salt was an essential preservative. It was, therefore, important to have local salt works. We know of at least 3 salt works that operated along the inner harbor. As noted on this slide, one was at Broad Cove. Another operated from the salt marsh that would later be filled in at what is now the bathing beach. And a third operated at nearby Mansfield Cove, which is now called Seal Cove. One of the attractions to Hingham of our founders was the forested hills surrounding the harbor. Having a ready source of timber was important, both for building homes and other structures in the town, and for the shipbuilding industry. In our early history, ships and goods from Hingham and the Boston area would have been part of the triangle trade shown on the map here that supported slavery. Lumber yards, as well as a variety of maritime businesses relying on lumber, were prominent among the harbor throughout the 19th century. On the right side of this slide, you see Kimball's Lumber Wharf, which had its own wharf. Kimball's Lumber Yard, which had its own wharf. We will revisit Kimball's Wharf on a later slide. Here you see that Whitney's Wharf was also a busy lumber business in the 19th century, the lumber schooner present there. Among the 19th century maritime businesses along the waterfront that relied on lumber were makers of masts and spars and barrels. Hingham's well-earned title of Bucket Town reflected the success of the coopering business, which made wooden buckets as well as barrels for the maritime trade and other uses. Beginning in the early 19th century, steamboat routes tightened Hingham's connections with the commercial markets and business opportunities in Boston. The steamboats also brought summer visitors to Hingham and nearby Nantasket Beach in Hull. Luther Barnes, who lived with his family on Summer Street, was a founder of the Boston and Hingham Steamboat Company. There were 3 primary wharves where competing steamship lines picked up and offloaded passengers and goods in those days. First, at the tag in the lower left of the image, is Litchfield Wharf, where the steamboat line, the People's Independent, operated. Today, this is the location of Hingham Harbor Marina. The next tag to the right is what we know as Barnes Wharf. This was the wharf where the Hingham, Hull, and Downer steamboat line operated. Today, it is home to the Hingham Maritime Center. And finally, at the third tag is another wharf then owned by the Barnes family. This wharf was home to the Boston and Hingham Steamship Company. In the 1830s to 1880s, the wharf connected to a path leading to a hotel on Summer Street, also operated by the steamship company. We'll see this hotel in a later slide. This wharf does not exist today. In 1849, steamships would begin to get some competition for both passengers and freight from the rail service that then started to run from Boston to Hingham. Here you can see the rails that extended via the bridge over the mill pond. Throughout the 19th century, Hingham's mill pond would continue to be a major feature of the harbor area. We know from a petition that our town historian found for us that in 1890, Charles B. Barnes, grandson of Luther, who founded the Steamboat Company, and other town leaders proposed petitioning the legislature to allow the mill pond to be filled, as it had become quite polluted by that time. But it would take more than half a century for that to happen. Here you get a view in the mid to late 19th century of the mill pond area immediately behind the town mill buildings, some of which still stand today in repurposed form at the intersection of North Street and 3A. The Liberty Grill. In this view from the early 20th century, you are looking from the mill pond toward the west. You are looking at the back of buildings along the mill pond that fronted on North Street. The 1870s map is useful to make note of a few things. Starting from the left, the marshes along Otis Street that would later become the bathing beach have not yet been filled. Otis Street does not yet connect with Summer Street as it does today. The Litchfield and Barnes wharves, as shown, include piers that extend into deeper water where the steamships could dock. And in the upper right is a photo of the old Colony House. This hotel on Summer Street, at what was known as Neck Gate Hill near Martin's Lane, was built by the Boston and Hingham Steamship Company, as we noted earlier, in 1832 to attract summer visitors. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1872. You may be surprised to learn of the heavy industry that operated at the harbor in the past. For example, in the 19th century, there were a couple of iron foundries and another foundry that made brass and copper fittings, hence the pollution in Mill Pond. Quite prominent along the harbor was the coal company that was founded by George Thompson late in the 19th century. Coal would have been used locally in both homes and factories then. Here you see the 3 large silos that George Thompson erected to store the coal that came in by barge. Also on this slide is a photo of the Thompson Coal Company office, today the site of Red Eye Roasters. This image from the 1908 Plymouth County Atlas shows where the coal company wharf was relative to both the Whitney and Kimball lumber wharves. The coal company property was sold to the town of Hingham in 1926. Today, the former coal wharf is a marina, and the property also includes the structure occupied by Red Eye Roasters. Here is a view inside the office of the Kimball Lumber Company along the harbor in the early 20th century. George Kimball is sitting at his roll-top desk. On the desk is an early telephone, and above, strung from a wire, is an electric light. In fire code? Anybody?
No comment.
In the late 19th century, Hingham Electricity, which also powered the trolley system in town, was first supplied by Weymouth Power and Light Company until Hingham created its own electric utility in 1894, based on town meeting vote in 1893. Here, George and his staff, including his nephew, James H. Kimball, in the left rear of the photo, seemed quite well dressed for what must have been a dirty environment at the lumber yard near the coal wharf. George appears prepared for various occasions with both a felt hat on the chair and a straw boater on the top of his roll-top desk. While this photo is not in perfect condition, we included it to make 2 points. One, the upkeep of the wharves involved hands-on labor in the early 20th century. And 2, the granite blocks that were the foundation of the wharves were originally from quarries in Hingham and Quincy. In the early 20th century, recreation joined industry on the wharves at Hingham Harbor. Here is a colorized postcard photo showing recreational boaters near one of the lumber wharves. This photo provides a glimpse of another recreational use of the harbor in 1911. The Hingham Yacht Club, which had been founded by George Cole and others in 1895, used a wharf adjacent to what was still the Thompson Coal Wharf in the early 20th century. This drawing, made by John Bouvet, shows this yacht club location in 1911. Today, this is where the boat ramp is located. In 1916, the Mass Legislature authored construction of a state highway from the easterly end of the state highway on Lincoln Street to West's Corner, the boundary with Hull and Cohasset, to accommodate the large volume of traffic through Hingham heading to Nantasket Beach and other parts of the South Shore. Before the new highway was built, traffic flowed from Lincoln Street to North Street. In this slide, you see before and after photos of the road along the waterfront. The improved and widened road for the state highway completed in 1918 required the removal of a few buildings. In 1920, this was the view from the intersection of Ship and Cottage Streets, showing some of the new state roadway along the coastline. And here is a view in 1923 of the roadway across Broad Cove. The state highway was paved with bituminous macadam, layers of crushed stone combined with a coal-based asphalt on a gravel base. Paved roads had become common in the 1880s and 1890s as a result of the national Good Roads movement, a movement begun by bicyclists. The first gasoline-powered vehicles were introduced in the late 1890s. In this 1936 map of the harbor area, you see Otis Street connecting with Summer Street in the seamless configuration we are familiar with today. In this undated, perhaps 1920s aerial view of the harbor area, the coal silos are an obvious feature of the harbor. Kimball and Whitney lumber wharves are also in operation still. As the 20th century progresses, though, retail establishments start to take the place of heavy industry at the harbor. Here you see Anderson's Market at the corner of North Street at 3A, where Star's is now located. Beale's Fish Market and Jenny's gas station are on the harbor side of Summer Street, where it meets up with Otis. By the mid to late 1930s, this transformation is more apparent, with auto dealerships and gas stations becoming fixtures at the harbor. By the late 1960s, there were reportedly 9 gas stations along Summer Street and North Street. In this photo, you see Steve Mail's Boathouse showroom on the left, in the location of today's Fruit Center Market. Over time, this location has been home to Litchfield's Auto Dealership, a bowling alley, the A&P Supermarket, and Best Chevrolet. Steve Mail also owned what had been Kimball's Wharf. That wharf later would be the home of First Quality Marine, the boatyard owned by the late Roger Merrill. The wharf is now Hingham Harbor Marina, owned by John Kinney. Recreation was becoming an established part of the harbor area throughout this period. In addition to boating, swimming was becoming popular, especially following the gift to the town in 1916 of the land that would become the Hingham Bathing Beach. These images are from the early 20th century postcards. At the top, you see the original bathhouse, which we are told had been a barn when the land was still owned by the Cornish family. The bottom photo shows some examples of vintage bathing attire. Fishing and early use of the harbor and mill pond was again popular in the mid-20th century. Here you see some locals, circa 1960s, fishing from a float off of what was then Keogh's Wharf, with a view of some deteriorating former industrial buildings on the former Kimball's Lumber Wharf. In 1953, Hingham's mill pond was at last filled, and the harbor area began to be renewed as roads replaced bridges. This is a view in the late 1960s or early 1970s from the cemetery over the train tracks, which were not in use at the time. What had been the open mill pond is today largely the downtown parking area, upgraded considerably in more recent history as part of the Greenbush Line reconstruction work. The new Greenbush commuter train line began regular service in October of 2007. This restored a rail link from Boston to Hingham that had been abandoned in 1959 when the Southeast Expressway opened. From the same late 1960s, early 1970s period, this photo shows the paved Station Street looking toward the flat-roofed building that would later become Tosca. In 1966, Charles Barnes gave Barnes Wharf to the town of Hingham. This 1975 view of the area shows the wharf several years later, before it had been transformed into what is now the Hingham Maritime Center. In the early 1970s, Lincoln Sailing Club was formed, and the town approved the use of Barnes Wharf as a location dedicated to community boating. Fast forward to 1988, when the trustees of the Lincoln Sailing Club, now the Hingham Maritime Center, raised the money to construct the Curtis Pavilion, which was formally given to the town of Hingham. A year later, in 1989, the town would acquire Whitney Wharf in a land swap with a car dealership, creating another opportunity for transformation at the waterfront. We now sail, or row, if you prefer, into the 20th century with Bill Reardon as guide. He will guide us through a quite exciting time in the life of Hingham Harbor Front.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Andrea, great job. And for all of you who don't understand, the real thing about this program is the lady right over here. Eileen put all this together and has just done a masterful job. We've just seen, to my mind, the best history of the harbor front that has kind of ever been encapsulated in one place. So, as Andrea mentioned, my job is to kind of pick it up from where she left off, somewhere around 2000, and roll us forward. I'm Bill Reardon, current chair of the Harbor Development Committee, succeeding a number of people, some of whom you'll see in these following pictures. So let's see if I can get this. There we go. So my purpose is to sort of walk you through a little bit of where we've been more currently and where we might be heading. I want to mention a couple of things. It's pretty clear that, and Andrea's already captured this, the evolution first from an industrial waterfront. Think about coal and lumber and barrels and fish. You know, this is not a nice place to bring your kids for a family outing. Then to more of a commercial setting. You were seeing these markets, you were seeing stores, you were seeing some, waterfront kind of uses. We're evolving. And then as we get into the 20th century, we're moving to more of the harbor recognized as a recreational location. What is it that causes that to happen? I'm mindful of a couple of things, three principally. Philanthropy, on the one hand. We've had some very generous people over time who have given substantial portions of land to the town for recreational purposes. The Barnes family comes immediately to mind, two wharves, both Barnes Wharf and Steamboat Wharf. I hadn't remembered whether the Thompsons sold their land or gave their land of the former coal, but they sold it. The town was opportunistic in terms of buying it. And then the other one that comes to mind is the bathing beach. We talked about the bathing beach as being having been given to the town. The town's also been smart. The land swap for what was a Plymouth Dodge automobile dealership on Whitney Wharf, an astute move on the part of the town a number of years ago. Two other factors. One, zoning. Zoning is really important in the town of Hingham, and we have created harborfront zones. Members of the planning board, one of whom is here this evening, former member of the planning board. It was important to create an overlay district for the harbor that headed us in the direction that the town wanted to go with the harbor, away from industrial, maybe a little less commercial, maybe more for enjoyment and recreation and all of that. And then the last piece, which is very important, is the Community Preservation Committee and the Community Preservation Act. which gave us the funds for a lot of what has subsequently happened in the harbor, much of which I'm going to be describing. Key things that come to mind: purchase of the mobile station, $1.8 million, commercial property, very valuable. If we had allowed that to continue as a commercial property, we might have had a big restaurant in that space. We still need to think about how to use it better, but the point is it's under our control, and that's a huge thing. So this first photo is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the kinds of things that happen at the harbor. On the left top, if I can work this, the red, there we go. This is the opening of the Whitney Wharf Bridge from the back of Red Eye Roasters over to Whitney Wharf. Former member of the Harbor Development Committee, Harry Way, who recently passed away. Fond memory for many of us involved in the harbor. On the right side, a very popular activity is the farmers market. Big deal. It's one of the largest farmers markets in Massachusetts now. Right at the side of the bathing beach. We've already talked about Hingham Maritime and their programs, both rowing and sailing. And there's always just an afternoon at the beach, in Bathing Beach Trustees. So to give you a bit of a sense of some of the interests that impact the harbor, I've been impressed over time in my involvement with the Harbor Development Committee at the number of different interests, different constituencies who care about the harbor. Everybody cares. They don't necessarily agree, but they do care. Think about it. We sail, we row, we kayak, we use the beach, we swim, we want food, we want the farmers market, we want walkways, we want all of that out of this space that Eileen has described as the harbor front. To do that, the Harbor Development Committee and the Bathing Beach Trustees, and we work very much hand in hand, really has to think both long-term in terms of, well, what's the plan? What's the design? How do we kind of fit these pieces in? And there are multiple jurisdictions that sort of have ownership or control over these different parcels. Sometimes it's the Conservation Commission, sometimes it's the Selectmen, sometimes it's the Bathing Beach Trustees. All of those have to be sort of balanced and weighed, and all of them have to buy in before we do anything on the harbor. I mentioned before the importance of being opportunistic. When we have a chance to buy something or to acquire it in some way, a land swap, we generally have done that. It has been made much easier and much more possible by virtue of the Community Preservation Act. We clearly have done things along the harbor by virtue of having that act in town. It's been a very important part of our mission. And finally, I'll mention, just to start, because I'm going to end there, that the harbor wharves are a major issue for the town. We've seen their history as lumber wharves, as coal wharves, as whatever, auto dealerships. They're part of our history, and that history is being changed by global warming and by sea level rise. And we will have to address that, and that will be in my comments. So to give you a little bit of sense of kind of the multiple interests and some of the infrastructure things that we've done, you see here on the left, the format here is going to be harbor development kind of stuff on the left and other stuff on the right. We kick off the 21st century with Whitney Wharf Project, a major impact for the town. We mentioned it earlier. This was a case of having a dealership kind of move out. They got some land somewhere in North Hingham in exchange, and that was a very good deal for the town. The dealership came down. We cleaned up the waste from their auto dealership and made it a wharf. And that's a function of the Harbor Development Committee at that time. Finished in 2004. Left open, we wanted to have a bridge to begin the business of walking along the harbor front and having that be easy, rather than right on Route 3A with a baby carriage and a dog. Because in front of that stone wall where the town brook comes out, it's pretty hard to go across. The master plan in 2007, first evidence of, CPA was involved in Whitney Wharf. The CPA came into being in Hingham in 2002. and the first funding, went to Whitney Wharf. But in 2007, we did go through using CPA funds to prepare a harbor master plan. I'll show you a picture down in there and use it as a vehicle for kind of orienting you to some of the places along the harbor. And then, as I mentioned earlier, 2008, town meeting buys the mobile station. A big step. Perhaps not so much with what we've done with it so far, because we're still kind of working that through, but in terms of what the alternatives might be. Those of you who were here long enough remember there was Good Ford. When I came to Hingham in 1956, they were in that location, along with the Veterans Park, that they held that whole space. The mobile station, when Good Ford went away, bought the property, put their new mobile station in. We lived with that for a lot of years. Mobile left in 2008. The site was cleaned up, and the town now owns that adjacent to Veterans Park. Other things going on. The rowing program gets going with Lincoln Sailing in 2002. Lincoln Sailing, Andrea mentioned the Curtis Boathouse. The farmers market begins to get started. They started in Station Street and later moved to a much more copacetic site. One of the reasons why it's so popular is people like to go on a Saturday morning right along the harbor and see their neighbors and just enjoy being in a beautiful place. Nick Bond, who's here tonight, gets involved as well, acquires Bear Cove Marina, and is the landlord for a popular coffee spot, Red Eye Roasters, in town. And that's mentioned down at the very bottom of the slide. So I mentioned the master plan. This is a little tough to see because it was a larger version. But I want to just walk you through a couple of things on here to orient you to some of the things that we'll talk about later. This is the bathing beach area. We refer to this as the Grove. Here's the bathing beach parking lot. Here is what we talk about as the bandstand parcel. Then the parking lot for the boat ramp, which is an important part of our harbor infrastructure. Then Town Pier, Iron Horse Park, picture the horse surrounded by water in the recent storm. Then Red Eye Roasters. Here's Whitney Wharf, already revived. What you don't see here in this 2007 plan is the bridge that now extends behind Red Eye Roasters and goes over to Whitney Wharf. This is so-called Veterans Park, POW, particularly Vietnam veterans. Here's the mobile station parcel with the mobile station still on it. This is privately owned. This is privately owned. That's Nick Bond's wharf. And then beyond the Rotary, Barnes Wharf, and finally Steamboat Wharf. Town owns Town Pier, Whitney Wharf, Barnes Wharf, and Steamboat Wharf. When I talk about the town-owned piers, those are the piers that we're referring to. Things that have happened, we'll describe a little bit. There was an Armstrong project to protect the Grove area. That's been completed, has been very important in terms of preserving the parking lot and the bank that is just below the bathhouse. Here's the parking lot. Some of you are aware this was the first piece of the Harbor Walk done in a brick setting that allows people to take carriages or dogs or whatever, but more importantly, a protection for the parking lot itself, which in some storms, before a major project was done, was actually undercutting the parking lot. We were losing 2 and 3 feet at a time at a storm in that parking lot. And now there is an Armstrong concrete interlocked thing underneath the sand dune that is along the front of that. And even in this last most severe storm, although we lost some of the sacrificial sand dune, the blocks held, they did their job, we lost no more parking lot. Here, the bandstand parcel, we'll talk a little bit about that later. Same on the improvements needed for the boat ramp, the launching area. And then we'll be talking about the harbor wharves in a few moments. So, bringing us forward to some of the more recent efforts. 2015 Harbor Development Committee. This is as I'm beginning to get involved. Deirdre Anderson was very key to this. She believed, look, as a town, we first needed to kind of reach out and say, what do people want from the harbor? And there was also the beginning of the effort to think about the Route 3A Summer Street transportation corridor and the issues of safety and passing across Route 3A to get to this harbor front area that we all value so much. So we went about doing a rather extensive survey conducted in the fall of 2015. 1,500 people responded. We were amazed in some respects. Some of this was, you didn't have to be a member of Hingham. You could respond to this even if you were from another community using the Route 3A corridor. But the majority of our respondents were from Hingham. Women responded extensively. 2/3 of our respondents were women. Age, a third, 35 to 44. But it was pretty much across the board. And interestingly, 57% own or use watercraft. That speaks to kind of the recreation focus of folks who care about our harbor currently. We did about 20 questions covering sort of a whole raft of things. Some focus on the transportation issues and the 3A corridor. Some were focusing on, well, what kind of amenities did people want to see along the harbor or want to see more of along the harbor? So this just gives you some sense. This was a little bit more focused on the safety issue, particularly for those trying to cross or get to certain parts of the harbor. Abutters cared at least as much, as if not more, than others, but that's understandable. I mean, people living on Summer Street have been living with a very dangerous situation and many dangerous accidents, and historically a lot of the accidents that gave rise to the most injuries, personal injuries. There is an ongoing harbor task force that has been created. Originally, this was kind of within the Harbor Development Committee. About a year ago, it was transitioned to a new structure, the Harbor Task Force, currently led by Judy Sneed, who was in the room, and she's still here. And they are going forward, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. You remember the town approved a $400,000 appropriation to do engineering and research to kind of think about, well, get ahead of the state. What do we want that corridor to look like, and what do we want it to accomplish? And that's the work of the task force working with outside consultants. The key takeaway there is safety, that's a real issue. The other one that I'd mentioned that the task force will need to deal with is the whole question of the Downtown Association wanting to create a better link to the harbor. We've had improvements on North Street. You may have seen after 7 years, we finally got rid of the light poles on North Street. They're gone. It's beautiful. We have lovely period lampposts, but you get to the corner where Stars is and suddenly it gets dicey. So we also wanted to get, again, some sense of, well, what do people care about most here? And it's interesting. The farmers market was absolutely number one, most important in terms of by that majority of people. But lots of the other kinds of things that we might expect. A sidewalk, bike path along the whole harbor. Think about Boston Harbor. There is now a walkway virtually from Charlestown to the Seaport District. And you can walk, it's public, it's by law, and that's true for Hingham as well. So that's a major point. The boardwalk, picnic areas, parking, big issue. The police chief is not here, the fire chief is here tonight, and I know the issue of parking, particularly around the 4th of July, is a big topic for the town.
Retired fire chief. Unless the chief is here, maybe he is. Retired.
Lincoln Maritime, important to a lot of people, and the Harbor Development Committee is well aware of that, and I'm glad that Nancy Kerber can join us tonight as the current president of the Hingham Maritime Center. And finally, but not way down on the list, 45, 50% people looking for give us some food on the harbor, please. You know, I mean, the Red Eye Roasters, you can get a sandwich, you can get a bagel, but you know, we're looking ahead, and Alan Peralta and the Bathing Beach trustees will have something to say about that. So just gives you a sense of the kinds of things that came out of the survey that we as a Harbor Development Committee are trying now to prioritize as we think about the direction that the harbor is going to take. So I'm going to go back to the earlier slide, talk about sort of current kinds of projects that we've been doing. Some of you people here, I recognize you know these things, but maybe it's just a reminder. So the Arborstone Wall, I mentioned that earlier, very important in terms of protecting the bathing beach. 2016, we go ahead with the beach stabilization. One of our problems with the major winter storms is sand migrating from the bathing beach down, covering over the boat ramp, and filling in our basin, which means we have to dredge more frequently, and that's expensive. So all of that is important. We did, I'm happy to say, complete the Whitney Wharf pedestrian bridge. I've enjoyed it. I think of the little parking lot at Whitney Wharf as kind of my personal parking lot. You guys should use it too. If you park there, you can go across to Tosca or Red Eye Roasters or whatever, and you don't have to get into the whole mess of, nobody parks there even in the summer. It's a great spot. Lincoln, sorry?
They will now.
Lincoln Sailing becomes Hingham Maritime, and very importantly for the town, here's a big step. We've been trying to work over time, thinking about how best to purpose the use of Barnes Wharf as a town amenity, particularly for youth. It's always, my kids went to and then taught at Lincoln Sailing when it was Lincoln Sailing. Now it's Lincoln Sailing and rowing, but it's Hingham Sailing and rowing. There are plans for new structures there. We need to incorporate all of that as we think about the wharves and what we're doing to address sea level rise and just the structure of the wharves themselves. Hingham Recreation, new activity. People hadn't sort of had an opportunity to have kayaks or paddle boards. I don't know how many of you have seen the number of folks who are out. I think the town has 10 or 12 kayaks and 6 or 8 paddle boards, and you can, for a very nominal sum, go down, work with the harbor master and recognition people, borrow those, go out into the harbor, tell them where you're going so they know how to find you when you blow away. But it's a great new location. And then, very importantly, and Alan Peralta will have an opportunity to respond to your questions later, the whole issue of a new bathhouse and a snack shack at the bathing beach, at the location behind the parking lot. The town has stepped up big time, so has the state. The town initially appropriated $150,000 to match a state grant. We got the state grant. We needed some more money a little later on, and we've done that, and we're pressing forward with bids. I say we, again, because Bathing Beach trustees and harbor development work very closely together to get that structure bid out and under construction in 2018. So let me skip past these because we talked about those. So a little more currently, what's up? Well, I mentioned the question of the harbor wharves. It's a big problem. We have started really in 2015 to initially do a physical survey of the condition of the various harbor wharves. That went well. It told us what we knew, but now with an engineering focus, what is it that we need to address and to fix, both just in terms of preserving the current wharves, but also dealing with the obvious fact that the seas are rising and our wharves are being overrun. And I'll have a photo a little later that demonstrates that. So that started, this says 2017, it was 2015's town meeting that first appropriated some monies for this. In 2017, an additional $240,000. We've now gone ahead, done the physical survey and sort of look at the visual survey, but more importantly, gone ahead and done test pits and borings to know what's underneath these wharves. Think about these wharves, Thompson Coal Wharf. Who knows what that was built on? It may be coal, slurry or whatever. Some of it's granite, but often these walls, I talked to our town engineer, and they sort of lay out a bed of big stones, and then they start putting these nice, rectangular granite blocks on top. And sometimes it held, and sometimes it begins to break up, particularly with ice and tidal damage over time. So we've been working very hard on that, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later and where we're going, particularly this year, 2018, looking ahead to this year's annual town meeting. I mentioned earlier the Route 3A task force beginning the work of thinking about how to redesign Summer Street, Route 3A, the Rotary, one lane, two, how do we cross the street, how do we encourage access to our harbor front and have more people enjoy it. We did do, as I mentioned, the first step of the boardwalk extension, the brick walkway, harbor walk we're calling it, along the front of the bathing beach. Some of you who may have been down at the bathing beach since the storms have noticed that now the section of the brick walkway is continuing up through what we call the Grove area, and will carry all the way to the sidewalk along Otis Street. So people coming from Crow Point can walk a brief bit along the highway, which is a little scary, with a child or a dog or whatever, but now get onto a nice brick walkway, bike path, whatever. And the plan is to continue that. Other things going on, I would just mention we're very fortunate to have a terrific harbor master. Ken Corson has been with the town in that capacity for at least 5 years. I want to say maybe more like 6 or 7. One of the things he's been working on is security and getting grants for his projects. He's now installed a security system for basically all of Hingham Harbor, both the inner harbor as well as the shipyard where the ferries come in. So from his office in the new transportation building at the shipyard, he has cameras focusing on virtually the entire harbor. So if someone is in extremis, he knows how he can get his boats out to address that in the most timely way. I mentioned earlier, last year the town meeting did come up with the additional funding necessary, we believe, to complete the bathhouse snack shack project. We'll talk about that during the Q&A. As part of all of that, we may contemplate, Bathing Beach trustees may contemplate a shift of where the farmers market is to something closer to the original bathhouse that we know. We're working that out with Mark Cullings and the folks at the farmers market. It's an important infrastructure thing for the town. I think we all enjoy it. We want it to keep happening. On the other hand, it can get pretty busy down there on a Saturday when the tide is in at noon. And the farmers market is there from 10 to 2. So it's pretty exciting. In 2018, hope to complete the bathhouse itself. So looking ahead to town meeting this year, there are 2 warrant articles on the agenda. Article 14, by the way, the warrant is only 35 articles long. It could be a one-night town meeting, folks, so come, vote, participate, and vote for these projects. There are two items that impact the harbor. One is Article 14 speaks about the town wharves and the need to, now that we're closer to knowing what it is that we want to do with the town wharves, beginning to put some money aside ourselves, hoping to secure a match from the state. The state requires a 20% down on the part of the town, so the ask is for $200,000 to support a state grant of $1 million. That's only the beginning, because the harbor wharves are going to be multiple millions to correct for all of their deficiencies and to address sea level rise. That will actually be the topic, and I'm going to advertise here for just a minute. Harbor Development Committee has a meeting on this Tuesday night. It's going to be at Town Hall. It's actually going to be in the school committee conference room. We will hear for the second time of proposals from our engineers on their recommendations for the type of increases of the walls surrounding the town piers, and restoration and repair of the failed portions that we know because of the surveys and because of the soil conditions. I've got a piece, some of you might have seen the Hingham Journal today. I have something called Commentary where I speak to what that meeting is all about. We'd like to have as much active participation as we possibly can. So that's one article. The second is a continuation of the Harbor Walk. We have two pieces now, one on the Bathing Beach parking lot, one in the Bathing Beach Grove. This portion, which is part of the Community Preservation Act recommendations, they approved it, the advisory committee recommended it. It's up to the town now to appropriate the portion of the dollars that would allow us to extend the boardwalk across the front of the bandstand area over to the parking lot where the boat ramp is. So we would now have 3 sections. The ultimate intent is, as we go forward with other projects, to continue that. When we redo the wharves, we'll continue to have a boardwalk just as Boston does. That's the intent. So with my advertisement out of the way, why do we need to do that? Because that's what Town Pier looked like the morning after the worst storm. You'll notice that, this is the Iron Horse. He's surrounded by water. That hill was an island that morning. This is a picture taken out of the back of Red Eye Roasters. The little shack that is the Harbor Master shack got thrown from its moorings. It was held on basically by the electric wire that went into to provide power. This is why we need to address sea level rise. And this was, yes, the 3rd highest tide since recorded time, which is something like 1928. So what's next? A little bit of peek of the future that was promised. I think I'm still on time. Some sense of what's on our agenda prospectively, that again, we will try to be opportunistic. We will try to keep the big picture. We're very aware from a financial perspective that dredging of the harbor is due. Happens about every 10 years. It was last done in 2009-10. So we need to financially set money aside for that. We do have some revenues from mooring permits and that kind of thing that allow us to reserve for that over time. We may get some help from the state. We talked about the boat ramp. Any of you who are boaters know when you drive your trailer down, you're on steel because the concrete is breaking up. We have an arrangement. The boat ramp and the boat ramp parking lot are controlled by the state because it's done by the Department of Fisheries. They want access to Boston Harbor, so they're willing to take care of it, and they're willing to build us a new boat ramp in exchange for our continuing to open our parking to anyone from anywhere. You can be from any other town and you can use that parking lot. But it's still a function of funding from the state. We've been working, and we have a plan which would create not only a new concrete and steel ramp, but also floats that will go out from that, so that when you launch your boat, it doesn't kind of float away. You can get out, tie it up, pull your trailer out of the way so the next person can get down and get their boat in. It will be a great amenity. It's probably a couple of years away. We talked about the wharf work, and we hope to start that. Some of you may have seen an article that Governor Baker recommended in his capital budget, $170 million for municipal infrastructure for wharf and sea level resiliency. By virtue of the effort that we've gone through over the last 2 or 3 years to have this engineering done, to have by hopefully the end of 2018 fully engineered design plans well along in permitting, we hope to be in the front of the line for requests to the state, assuming that the governor's capital budget is approved. The Maritime Center, many of you know, is entering into a major fundraising effort to build a new multi-purpose boat house to house all of their rowing boats and many of their programs. Nancy will have an opportunity perhaps during the Q&A to describe that a little bit. One of the other things that we've toyed with during this time frame but held off on, the Hingham Rec Commission, led by Vicki Donlin, has been looking at a play area, not a playground, not fenced in, and not big structures that would, intersect the views, but a play area so that when you're down with small kids at the baby beach, hopefully getting a burger and an ice cream at the new snack shack, there'll be a spot that your kids can run around on a supervised basis. Longer term, the 3A corridor, this is really the work of the Harbor Task Force. I think we heard from our town engineer, Roger Fernandez, that the town is on the TIP list, which is a very important mass transportation list. We're on for attention to that corridor in 2022. Well, that seems like a long time, but we didn't get on the TIP list for the Derby Street project for how many years? Judy, I'm not sure. And the point is,
It took about that long.
yeah, these are very long-term kinds of things. You need to be prepared. That's why when the town agreed to set money aside to do this kind of preparatory work was the right answer. Because now, we will be prepared when the state is ready. This summer, for the first time, there will actually be a pilot project trying one lane each way on Summer Street going down toward Hull from roughly the end of May, beginning of June until sometime in August to see whether the newly designed narrowed car street activity on Summer Street and parts of Rockland Street will work. The traffic engineers believe it will, but this is a really important step heading toward redesign of the 3A corridor. I mentioned the wharf work. I expect it may be multiple years. We may need to go back to the state. We may need to go to town government. We may need to speak to the voters in terms of saying, look, it's time. All of these wharves need attention. We just need to look at this to be reminded that it's not 3 and 4 years out, it's now. And it's not going to get any less. It's if anything, it's going to get more. We believe, as a Harbor Development Committee, that we're heading in a direction that would have obviated this. For those of you who are down in the harbor, you'll know that Whitney Wharf was not overcome. Its height is about 11 feet. If we moved to the height that we want for Town Pier, we would not have had water on Town Pier either. Finally, but importantly, you looked at the master plan early on. That was a dream. Landscape people come up with ideas to force us to kind of think ahead. Some of the things on that harbor master plan have never happened and probably won't ever happen. But it's an important part of the infrastructure, and I'm happy to say that the money that the town set aside, a portion of that has been allocated to a landscape designer to work with the 3A task force and the Harbor Development Committee and the Bathing Beach trustees to create sidewalks and a plan that would be consistent in terms of the use of materials, the look and feel of this as we go across the harbor. This is where the vision thing comes in. We try to affect that. It's tough sometimes, but we are working there. So I think with that, we are to the point where Arlene is now going to lead us in our conversation.
Sure, and I just want to quickly, if you have not already written out a question or two, please do so quickly. Patty will help collect them because that's how we're going to ask questions of the panelists. And we're going to move this microphone over there as soon as I finish. I just wanted to remind you that joining Bill and Andrea on the panel are Alan Peralt, who is the chair of the trustees of the Bathing Beach, and Nancy Kerber, who's the president of the Board of Trustees of Hingham Maritime Center. So some of the things that Bill talked about, either that are on the agenda right now or might happen in the future, certainly you might want to direct a question to Alan or Nancy. So please write those questions down. We'll continue to collect them, but I will take the ones that we have so far. All right. So this could be a very short Q&A, but really this is your time. So this is a long question. I'm just going to read it. Has consideration been given to relocating the sidewalk on the north side of 3A onto Hingham Land to create a separation, a tree or lawn, between the roadway and the walkway? This would create a safer, more pleasant environment for pedestrians, not unlike the new sidewalks on Union Street near the high school and recreational fields.
So I'll take a crack at that, but we might also look to even Judy Sneath, who's the chair of the task force. But very much part of the task force work, working on the corridor, started within the Harbor Development Committee until the selectmen concluded, this requires more than just harbor. But from the beginning, the thinking has been safety, safety, safety. How do we encourage people to use the harborfront area? And one of the ways is to make it safer to be walking along the stretch on the north or east side of Route 3A as you're going to and from the various harborfront activities. There's a term, and I'm forgetting it right now. The state is very much into sharing the roadway, and that concept is narrowing streets, but adding more bike paths and more walkways. That's part of the notion of perhaps narrowing Summer Street from 2 lanes in each direction to 1 lane in each direction to allow more bicycle traffic, more pedestrian traffic. So that is, absolutely part and parcel of kind of thinking about and working with a landscape designer. Do you want it just to be a sidewalk along the road, or do you want it to have some setback? And so I don't know who asked the question, but that is the intent. The right place to worry about that and to explore it would be to come to some of the 3A task force meetings and raise that at those meetings. Here you go.
This question to
Eileen?
Bill. I can speak.
Okay.
Are you aware that the statue at the harbor, erected in 1929, the Victory statue, is made of bronze, not iron? I did hear that from Alec as we were preparing this. Yes, we should not call it the Iron Horse statue.
I don't know where the name the Iron Horse statue came from. Alec probably knows. Alec McMillan, the town historian who's here. But absolutely, I'm certainly aware because I think community preservation funds cleaned up the bronze, over the last couple of years. So it is not iron, it is bronze, it's beautiful.
You touched on this a little bit. What is the problem that the state is trying to solve with single lane 3H and Nantasket? And just because I live in the neighborhood, I know a little bit about this. It's not single lane all the way to Nantasket. It's single lane from the Rotary to just more or less this Muzzie's Corner is where they're going to test that out. And the driver of this is safety. The accidents and the seriousness of the accidents, the deaths and serious injuries are what is driving that. It's a very dangerous turn, and the speeds are what's driving the seriousness of the injuries, and single lane will reduce the speeds. So that's a quick answer to that one. Yeah, what's that, please?
Stand up. Or you just use this.
Use the mic, Eileen.
Okay, so we may not have fully recorded that, but if anyone else wants to chime in, the intent in testing the single lane on 3A from the Rotary to Muzzie's Corner is the only area that would be single lane, and it is driven entirely by safety. What Bill was talking about is, the state wants to enhance new roads with with opportunities for biking and safe walking, and so that's always part of the state thinking. But the driver here is safety for people driving in their cars, and that is what's been behind the plan. It's a very dangerous area. For those of us who live in the area, we know about that. Next question. At the end of the Harbor Walk, under construction is a very narrow sidewalk to Crow Point. But where is the crosswalk to get to the other side of Route 3A by the bus stop?
We talked earlier about the problem with crossing 3A. There are really only 2 legal crosswalks. I think one is right at the bathing beach, and there is a light. It's a very old light. It's not a very effective light, but it works. And the other one is right in front of Stars. There are no other marked crosswalks across Route 3A, and that's a problem. People coming from Derby or from that neighborhood, people crossing, on Summer Street, you sometimes take your life in your hands. I know about the narrow sidewalk along Otis Street from the bathing beach to the beginning of Crow Point. It's very dangerous. It was badly damaged in this last storm. You might have seen the work with the state actually out there repairing, because I think the sidewalk was actually being undercut. So people would be worried about, walking on that sidewalk this summer. But I think it has been repaired, at least for now. Part of the issue for the task force is to think about the crossways from the other side of where the harbor is to get to the harbor, because I think everybody wants to be able to get to the harbor and safely, and often with kids and with dogs.
I'll touch on that for a second, too.
Go ahead.
And this is something Judy Sneath could touch on as well. I'm also with Judy and Bryce Blair and Paul Healy and Deirdre Anderson on the 3A study. And one of the biggest goals, as Bill touched on, is certainly, and one of the reasons the consultant was hired is they were the most proactive in the interviewing process about the necessity of linking our downtown with the waterfront. May as well be the Berlin Wall in many cases. I've told this story a couple of times. The first day I went on the Harbor Development Committee about 11 years ago, I walked along the whole thing and happened to be by the traffic signal control box opposite Stars on the 3A side. And a young fellow who was about 13 years old asked me if I needed help getting across the street. And I've always looked at that as like, from the mouths of babes in the sense of that's what's missing. And so as Bill touched on, I think one of the important things of Judy's committee that we're working on is going to be how we improve pedestrian access. And certainly the question's a very good one. One of the toughest spots right now, the project limits stop at the light at the bathing beach. We tried to get them as wide as possible, but that's where it is. So I think that's something that certainly the Crow Point neighborhood and the town should look at in the future, because that stretch of walkway from where our brick boardwalk is going to end, going to Otis Hill, is a treacherous area, and I don't know, it may get down to having a cantilever or something, or alignment of the roadway, but I think it's something we should continue to pursue.
Not sure that's working.
That seemed to die too.
Testing.
Yes.
Nope.
Okay.
Nope.
So a PSA.
Face down. These are only for the,
Yeah, a PSA, April 11th at 7 p.m., there's a public information session about the pilot road diet project that will be explained by the 3A task force. And so you're invited to attend that at Town Hall somewhere. I'm sure it'll be in the Hingham Journal. So a question about the Maritime Center. So the question is, what is the vision for the Maritime Center? And with the high school rowing teams leaving for Bear Cove Park, does that change the Hingham Maritime Center planning for the future?
So the plan for the Maritime Center is to build a.
doesn't work.
It's back and forth. To build a new boathouse that would accommodate boat storage. That even with the raising of the wharf, we would plan on the first floor being able to be flooded. The building strategies can accommodate that. Boat storage wouldn't be horribly adversely affected if water comes through, but it wouldn't be once the wharf is raised. And then also having a a multi-purpose room that could serve as a workout space for the high school students, Hingham Maritime classes. We would have the ability to have maritime education classes, ecology classes, just be able to offer a lot more to the town and more connection to the harbor. We'd be able to build out with that new facility, have bathrooms. And be able to, build out our programming, get more kids out in boats of all varieties onto the harbor. The high school and the Back River is, for now, it's a pilot program. It's meant to be a program that gets them on the water a little earlier in the season on calmer water, a little bit quieter. When we get our docks in, they'll be back at Hingham Maritime for the rest of the season. And then potentially, if this, pilot program that they're doing this spring works, the high school would be able to use it on a bad day. Potentially Hingham Maritime could use it, the Back River site, during the construction process, so that we can continue some of our programming a little bit over there.
And not too far away from the Maritime Center, question about Steamboat Wharf. And now this is, I believe the question relates to the wharf that you may just barely see if you drive by, but if you walk past the Maritime Center up the hill on Summer Street, you'll see this overgrown wharf. Looks very pretty. There's a path that goes down there, but it's a little bit treacherous, hasn't been maintained that well. So the question is, thinking toward the future, has any consideration been made to beefing up or improving Steamboat Wharf for increased or improved public access?
If the person who asked that question has the money to make it happen, the Harbor Development Committee is willing to work with you and any others. This is the wharf. It's the second of the two wharves given to the town by the Barnes family. Barnes Wharf is where Hingham Maritime is. If you were standing in front of Hingham Maritime and looked to your right, it's the next wharf. It is the most damaged of any of the town wharfs. The end of it is actually sort of coming apart. What happens with these major storms is the waves overtop the wharf itself. The material that's behind the granite begins to wash through the granite, and then the granite blocks begin to fall in. I have rowed past this, and you'll see, the end of the pier is literally coming apart. On the flip side, the landscape architect who came to work with us to begin to think about a landscape plan for the harbor saw that wharf and said, "Wow, what an opportunity this is. What are you going to do with this?" And I said, currently, probably nothing, because first I need to explain, it's not the same as the other wharves in terms of its danger for sea level rise, because it is further out, away from the downtown, the low portion of downtown, including the Rotary. Summer Street begins to go up the hill, so this wharf is kind of beyond all of that. So it's not, I talked about working on the town wharves, and you'll notice that Steamboat Wharf was not mentioned as one of the prioritized town wharves. We don't currently intend to rebuild that, because at this point we don't have the funds and we don't have the plan to work with that wonderful wharf. And as I said, if there were an opportunity, it is town owned, no question. There was a time when Hingham Maritime, Lincoln Maritime before, contemplated running their sailing program out of one of the wharves and the boating program out of the other, but it became just prohibitively expensive to try to do both.
With tough accessibility too.
Yes.
Right.
Great. And I think, Bill, you're going to have the answer to this as well. What do we know about the rise of sea level in the Hingham Harbor over the last 10 years, and what do we think will happen over the next 10 years?
Anyone asking that question knows that you can ask many scientists and get many different answers about this. I mean, there's a there's almost a scientific community and environmental community battle going on about is sea level rise real? Do we really have to worry about this? I can only speak from 1956. I've lived along Summer Street, Steamboat Lane since 1956. I have never seen tides that overtopped and surrounded the Bronze Horse. It's just never occurred. Steamboat Lane is a private lane that comes down to my home. I'm beginning to think that I'm going to have to work with some of my neighbors to do something about the wall in front of our own home, because literally these waves, which are coming absolutely right at us, these nor'easters, 5 of them, I think Nick Bond said earlier, have been coming right at us. I can just speak from kind of personal experience that over the last 10 years, there's been a fairly dramatic difference. Projecting is the really hard part. Part of what we've been trying to work with our Beals and Thomas, our engineering consultants, on the project for the harbor wharves, and also drawing on the work. Some of you may remember about 3 years ago, engineering firm called Kleinfelder did a sea level rise and resiliency project for the town to identify what are the areas that are going to be the most impacted by sea level rise. I have some pictures elsewhere, not in this presentation, where they projected and gave a visual, an image of what would it look like as you looked at stars from the Fruit Center, in 2030 at a high level tide, and in 2070. In 2030, they showed cars going along 3A with water over their hubcaps, over their tires. In 2070, the cars are just barely visible, saying in the worst of storms in 2070, given current projections, and this is all about projections and what happens to CO2 and what the world does and the Paris Accords and all of that. It's a very serious topic. It's very argumentative. It's very political. So I can't answer for the next 10 years. I don't think anybody can. I believe sea level rise is real based on my own personal experience of 60 plus years.
And I have a topic that I want to get a little bit more information about, and that's about the bathhouse and the
Sure.
snack shack, and I just want to get a sense of where you are on that and what kinds of snacks you're going to have.
Sure. We've been working with the Bathing Beach trustees, and Ed Johnson, one of the other trustees, is in the audience today. We've been working with the town engineering department, and actually, I'm sure that Bill would say the same thing. They are essentially a great resource for harbor development and the Bathing Beach trustees, given that neither of us have staff. So we did put it out to bid. Sevi Starkolowski is the architect on the project. We put it out to bid under conventional Chapter 149 bid requirements, which includes filed sub-bids for any trade with a value over $10,000. Needless to say, the bids came in higher than we expected. We have regrouped, and it'll be advertised next week in the Central Register, and it's going to go under what's called a modular exemption. So the building could be built in sections with the same aesthetics. We still have to meet the very same historical standards. The roof's going to be the same, the materials are the same, but our initial estimates are that the savings could be about 20%. So if all that happens, we have a lot of utility work to do too, because there is almost no utilities. Nancy can speak to this as well. You don't realize until you get over there, there's no sewer, no gas, no water, no power of any consequence. So we have, between foundation and utility work, about $250,000 to $275,000 just to get sufficient utilities to that site. So that in and of itself is a big expense. So we hope to get all of this stuff rolling, probably just the site work itself during the summer, and if with good fortune, the building itself probably by late summer, early fall. It'll go up quickly though this way. The foundation will have to be in. As to the vendor we're very fortunate is Greg Acera of Fire King, who does Tosca, Stars, whatever. He's still enthused, even though we've had a little hiccup. He's signed extensions. He's looking at this as a long-term thing. It's not going to be the biggest moneymaker in their in the chain places they own, but I think he's enthused by what he's seen in places like Nantucket and other waterfront sites of what this could do. And his thoughts are as a fairly upscale eatery. You'll still get hot dogs and hamburgers, but, you know, juice drinks, high-end ice cream, things like that. And we're also working with the rec department on, we're doing a community room as part of this. It'll be about a 500 square foot room. And they're interested in doing yoga classes and other things like that. It'd be an ideal place to have anniversary parties, rehearsal dinners, things of that nature. And Greg, is, as well as some others, are interested in catering that. So, knock on wood, everything, you know, will follow through.
May I add something to that? I would just like to clarify that the Historic Districts Commission, which I staff, was very helpful, I think, in having this approved, because that is in the local historic district. One of the things that was a challenge was that, as many of you already know, that in most cases in a historic district, the standards are to use natural materials, things that, and that's pretty standard all over the place. We don't use replica materials. Architectural features need to be made out of standard materials. So, in this case, however, happy to say that the Districts Commission, because of the proximity of this building to the sea and to the harbor, and to and because of the the winds, and you understand what I'm saying, that they did approve all of the materials that were proposed by the trustees.
Right.
So,
'Cause
just to clear that up, so people who love to hate the Historic Districts Commission.
No, we've got great cooperation from the zoning board, the planning board, historic districts. And the idea is also, this is gonna be a town building, we have to maintain it. So it's in a, as Bill has pointed out, it's in a tough area. It will be designed above the flood elevation, similar to the buried sea wall, similar to the Armorstone wall, so the first floor elevation is above elevation 14. So we've taken all that into consideration, and similar to what Nancy was saying, any foundation, whatever we have, can be designed to take water and let it go out. So we've been cognizant of that, but we also wanted to have, while still having the architectural look we wanted, to still have materials that can hold up in that kind of environment. I mean, it's not going to be a new pro window we're having in there. They're going to be fiberglass mullion windows, so trust me, we're not, this isn't, it still is going to have a rich detail. It's just that it has some materials that will be more forgiving in that environment.
Well, with that, I think we have answered the questions that were suggested by the audience, and I appreciate all of them. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Hingham Land Conservation Trust, I thank you for being here, and also wanted to let you know we do have a spring walk coming up. We're not sure whether it's the first or second weekend of May, but that's what it's looking like. And there'll be more information about that coming either by email blast if you're a member, and we encourage you to get on our list as a member, or on our Facebook page or on our website. So there'll be opportunities for you to learn about the walk. We'll get something into the Hingham Journal as well. Thank you again for coming, and stay in touch.